Independence Day is a major event for any country. For Israelis, many of whom escaped persecution in other nations, it means even more. Israel recently celebrated its 61st birthday as a modern nation, but it's not been an easy ride. For most of those years, Israel has fought off attacks from Muslim neighbors committed to its destruction. Egypt once led the charge to push Israel into the sea. But after 4 major wars, the late Egyptian president Anwar Sadat decided he'd seen enough. Sadat stunned the world in 1977 by traveling to Jerusalem and speaking before the Israeli Knesset. 2 years later, he stood alongside Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and U.S. President Jimmy Carter here at the White House, becoming the first Arab leader to recognize Israel as a nation. Despite what seemed like overwhelming odds, the agreement reached between Begin and Sadat still stands today.
The first thing he said, there will be no more war between Egypt and Israel.
Jehan Sadat's new book, My Hope for Peace, describes her late husband's reasons for coming to peace with Israel.
Both sides are losing their sons. Our economy is affected by war. Why are we going through war every few years? And this is something from a military man who turned from being a military man for war to be a man for peace.
Israel soundly defeated Egypt 3 times before the 1973 Yom Kippur War. In that conflict, a surprise attack led to initial gains for Egypt and Syria until Israel eventually recovered and pushed them back. Sadat says Egypt's performance in this war restored a sense of pride, making it easier for her husband to pursue peace. But he had few supporters.
Everyone around him, the people in the government, the friends, the family, everyone were telling him, don't do it, don't go, it is risky, you will lose your friends, you will lose the Arabs, you will lose even your position, you will lose your life. But he never, ever wavered.
Many of those warnings came to pass. After the treaty, Egypt was kicked out of the Arab League, and one by one, Arab nations cut off relations with the country entirely. The worst was still to come.
I knew that I am going to lose him.
Sadat's new relationship with Israel also infuriated Islamic radicals, who assassinated him in 1981. But many analysts believe Sadat's legacy can be seen in the 1994 peace agreement between Israel and another longtime foe, Jordan. Beyond Egypt and Jordan, however, Israel has found few neighbors willing to extend the olive branch.
Do they really want to make peace with Israel? Are they willing to accept Israel, recognize Israel's existence, living here in the region as Sadat did?
Jonathan Peled is a spokesman for the Israeli embassy in Washington.
And the other question is whether they're willing to learn from what Sadat made, his historic visit to Israel, and to really reach out to the Israeli public opinion.
Peled says Israelis would welcome Arab leaders who, like Sadat, might change tactics and turn away from violence.
There's definitely a great desire among the Israeli public to finally reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians, with Syria, with Lebanon, because we're tired of living under constant threat and constant warfare.
In the case of Syria, the price may be too steep.
The contours for peace are drawn. They're very, very clear. It's land for peace, with all what that entails.
That would mean giving up the Golan Heights region, a strategic and protective buffer along the Syrian border. Jehan Sadat believes that Israel should also give up territory to the Palestinians, just as it relinquished the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in 1979. Peled says it's not that simple. Tiny Israel gave up land twice in this decade alone, pulling out of Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005. Attacks against Israel increased in both instances.
Unfortunately, all we received in return is more terrorism, rockets, missiles being shot out from both Lebanon and from Gaza.
Ironically, the same forces aligned against Israel are now threatening Egypt. Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah have criticized Egypt for its refusal to allow Hamas members to enter the country from Gaza. In addition, Egyptian authorities recently arrested 25 Hezbollah operatives for planning attacks on Egyptian soil. Another 24 remain at large. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak blamed Iran and warned its leaders not to meddle in Egyptian affairs.
I think there's a growing understanding now among most of the Arab countries that Iran is undermining any kind of efforts for peace, for reconciliation, for negotiation.
Israel's peace with Egypt has been described as a cold peace. Other than government contacts, the nations still don't have much interaction. The Egyptian media also remains notorious for its anti-Semitic content. Sadat says the imperfect relationship is a work in progress, one that, despite its flaws, would have made her husband proud.
What could Arab leaders today learn from his example?
They should think about the people whom they are responsible to give them peace and to let the new generation be brought up in a peaceful atmosphere.
Eric Stakelbeck, CBN News, Washington.